We start first with Rebecca Lewis.
Thanks, Keith. The work I'm presenting today is through a NITSE-funded project called Assessing State Efforts to Integrate Transportation, Land Use, and Climate. We're looking at 4 states. This panel was rated to Oregon and California, but as Keith mentioned, we'll also talk a little bit about Maryland and Washington. These 4 states we chose because they either have integrative land use approaches or integrated climate approaches in California's case. And so they provide a good test case of looking at the integration of climate change, transportation, and land use planning at the state level. I'm working with a broad team of graduate students, 2 of whom are in the room, and my co-PI, Rob Zako, who's down the hall. And we've been working on this project for a little over a year. And I'm going to be focusing on the big high-level questions, talk a little bit about the state approaches to distinguish these 4 different state approaches, but spend most of my time talking about synthesis. The rest of the panel is going to go into a lot greater depth about Oregon and California and really specifics about the implementation of those things. So in our project, we're looking at the framework for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. When we're talking about the 3-legged stool, we're really concerned here about vehicle miles traveled. We want to know the strengths and weaknesses of these different approaches at the state level and the obstacles to achieving the greenhouse gas reduction goals. The intent is that we come up with information that we can share with the other states. As Keith mentioned, these states are laboratories, and these 4 states that we picked are really the leaders in this type of policy. Lauren will talk a little bit more about California and maybe mention some of the recent failed legislation, but all these other states are looking to what California and Oregon are doing to figure out how they can approach these questions. So as I mentioned, conceptually we're trying to look at how land use patterns, transportation options, and climate change are integrated, particularly how transportation and land use work together to reach these greenhouse gas reduction targets. Put a different way, we have broad greenhouse gas reduction goals at the state level. Each of these states has adopted a goal in statute. We have all these different sectors, including electricity, all these other things. We're really focused here on transportation sector. Within transportation, we're focused on vehicle miles traveled, which gets at transportation and land use patterns. And the ways in which we can affect vehicle miles traveled to ultimately reduce greenhouse gas emissions happen through transportation strategies, like changing mode split and those other sorts of things, through pricing approaches and making driving more expensive, and land use strategies of putting origins and destinations closer together to reduce vehicle miles traveled. As I mentioned, each of these states has passed in statute goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, broad goals that encompass all sectors. As you notice, each of these states has a 2020 goal. Not all states have yet adopted a 2050 goal in statute. In California, the 2050 goal is an executive order, and one of the bills that failed in the legislature this session was putting this 2050 goal in statute. But all of these states are unique in having these goals in statute. They all also have something else that goes further than that. And in many cases, it's going further by focusing on the transportation sector in particular. So I'm going to go through the states and talk a little bit about the differences across the states. But as I mentioned, I want to spend most of the time talking about synthesis. California is well known for SB 375, which passed in 2008. The approach to California to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation is by establishing regional per capita greenhouse gas reduction targets, requiring that MPOs develop sustainable community strategies that are integrated with the regional transportation plans, and then relying on voluntary local implementation from cities to be able to reach those goals. Lauren's going to talk a lot more about cap and trade and some of the funding that's been made available to actually implement these things and the process by which that funding has been distributed. Across these other 3 sectors of looking at transportation and land use, California is in the process of updating its state transportation plan and show how it's going to reach greenhouse gas reduction goals from the transportation sector, doing its own scenarios at the state level. Along land use, California is unique from these other states in that it's not seen as a strong growth management state. There are local general plans, but there's no state review of these things. There's no requirement for urban growth boundaries. Land use is really a creature of the local government in California. So the way these things are coordinated gets at using regional level transportation planning to show how MPOs are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Maryland is completely different from these other states in that Maryland has a state-level greenhouse gas reduction plan that instead of focusing just on transportation, they set a state-level target for each individual sector. And at the state level, they integrate this greenhouse gas reduction plan with their transportation plan and with Plan Maryland, which is their state development plan. So Maryland has focused really heavily on the state level so far and has done very little with the regions and local governments. But this is a completely different model than these other states have taken in terms of deflecting authority to regional and local governments. Oregon's model follows California's to a certain extent in establishing regional metropolitan targets, which are shown very small here. Kim's going to be talking a lot more about what the Portland metro region has done around climate-smart communities. The thing to know about Oregon is that while California required all MPOs to go about this process, in Oregon we really only required Portland and Eugene to do anything, and we really only required Portland Metro to adopt anything to show how they're going to reach these targets. So far the Oregon approach is really focused on the Portland region. But Oregon's been doing a whole lot around land use for decades, around urban growth boundaries. Oregon's been really well known for integrating transportation and land use planning as well. And so the question with the Oregon piece is how this climate piece relates back to what Oregon's already been doing around transportation and land use. Washington is a state that on paper kind of looks a little bit like California and Oregon by having greenhouse gas reduction targets and Washington being unique in having VMT per capita targets. But Washington's approach hasn't worked out so well in terms of getting the regional governments to take part in this. Washington's been a state that's done a lot of studies about how we can integrate their growth management program and climate change planning, but very little has actually been adopted and implemented in Washington. It's been accumulation of a lot of executive orders, a lot of studies, but little progress towards linking the Growth Management Act to the greenhouse gas targets. What's been happening in Washington has primarily been happening with MPOs, particularly Puget Sound Regional Council, doing stuff on their own because they want to. So in terms of trying to synthesize what's happening across these states, as I mentioned, all of these states have goals, but how these goals look varies. So as I said, all of these states have the high-level goals that say we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by X% by this year. Some states have targets for each individual sector and do really extensive modeling to figure out what the share should be. But states like California and Oregon have established regional targets and then asked the regional governments to go about, or the regional MPOs, regional agencies to go about showing how they're going to reach those targets. Vertical integration has been really strong, and by vertical integration I mean how the state interfaces with the regional and local governments. It's been very strong in California and Oregon, requiring involvement of MPOs. It's been less strong in places like Washington and Maryland. But in Maryland, the horizontal coordination has been very strong. Agencies have been working together on state-level plans that focus on these three areas: climate change, land use, and transportation. And California and Oregon have great examples. In Oregon of transportation and land use working together, and in California of having the Strategic Growth Council, which takes all these agency heads that have things to do with growth and asks them to meet and make decisions. In terms of monitoring, this is a big area of kind of question right now. These approaches are relatively new. There are requirements for reporting across many of these states, but there's really no one at the end of the day that's going to be an enforcer and say, you have a Metro 2020 target, you're all out of office because you haven't met this goal that you established 20 years ago. And that's a huge challenge in a lot of these states when we ask stakeholders in interviews, who's holding you accountable? The answer is generally, well, there really isn't anyone holding us accountable, or it's the citizens holding us accountable. But there's not a big stick to a certain extent to be able to enforce to get to these goals. So in terms of process, in terms of what we can learn for other states and how you get here, Lauren's going to talk a lot more about this later on, but there's been a really broad range of stakeholders and actors and coalitions involved in pushing the original legislation, and that's varied across states. But these organizations have worked together, and environmental groups have been very important in pushing the original legislation. They're also proving to be very important in keeping the state accountable for actually getting here. Something else that has been a lesson out of Oregon and California has been allowing flexibility. So the nice thing about this approach that many regional governments see is, or NPOs see, is they have flexibility in showing how they're going to reach these targets. There's no requirement to implement a specific policy. Your job is to reach your target, and how you do that is completely up to you. And this flexibility and allowing this flexibility has been really important in getting buy-in for these approaches. Something Joffrey's going to talk about later on is the modeling and this heavy reliance on modeling. So to show that we're going to reach these targets, we have to have good data and good modeling. The technical capacity varies really broadly across NPOs, and so we're putting a lot of stock in these models being good and getting the right answers in terms of showing we're going to reach these targets. And having funding and technical assistance to get there has been important. Many of these approaches have relied on scenario planning. This is one out of the climate smart communities, but these often rely on showing different scenarios and selecting a preferred scenario that shows how we're going to reach these targets. And then in terms of process, it's across these states, it's been really important that there's an agency that has statutory authority, budget, and the ability to hold the regions accountable and hold other state agencies accountable. In California and Maryland, they relied on the existing environmental agency to serve this role. In Oregon, the Global Warming Commission has been responsible for doing this, but this model has not been quite as effective because it's an organization that has very little staff, very little budget. If Angus Duncan was here, he would say the same thing, that they were giving very little statutory authority, and so it's been really difficult to rely on this type of organization to actually hold the agencies and local and regional governments accountable. And then finally, in process, silos have been seen as hampering the implementation and hampering the ability to reach these targets, and that's something that hasn't been solved just yet. And then something that I think Kim will talk a little bit about more as well is many regions are figuring out that it's important to convey co-benefits, and that this is not just about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it's about all these other things that we get. We heard this morning in the first keynote around reducing greenhouse gas emissions also carries equity. It's often the best thing for equity. It's often the best thing for the environment, for transportation choices. And so selling that to citizens has been seen as very important as well. And then finally, in terms of implementation, and I'll pass it off to Joffrey, there's so far been a weak integration of land use and transportation plans and how these things are funded. So we see this recommendation around making transportation funding contingent on land use plans, using performance measures integrated in the transportation funding process. In Oregon, example, making UGB expansion contingent on going through scenario planning, since it's been voluntary for many regions here. And then one of our biggest challenges in implementation across all states and all regions has been the lack of funding and incentives for planning at the local level, as well as the lack of funding for transit and infill projects. So many of these states have constitutional limitations on gas taxes that can't be used for transit and bike ped funding, and that's been a huge hindrance to actually getting there. Kim will probably talk about, in Metro, the plans get you there, but it's the funding that can actually finance those plans that's a really big challenge that we have to figure out a way to come up with a solution to that problem. And then the last thing, as I mentioned earlier, there's really no one holding states and regions accountable to reaching these targets. So environmental groups and public opinion have shown it's very important to actually holding the government accountable for reaching these things. So key takeaways from what we've seen in evaluating across states. The initial legislation is really important to setting the goals and can serve as a doorway to open up more regulatory reform, more pieces of legislation that try to get you there. But it's important to have sustained leadership and momentum. What a lot of these states are facing right now is that these initial goals and statutes were passed under previous governors, previous legislatures, and they're not paying attention anymore. And so there's very little accountability from the executive and legislative branches in the process. The plans and scenarios are great, and it's important to have good models, but without adequate funding to reorient transportation funding, we're not going to realize those plans and scenarios. But selling the co-benefits has been important to actually gaining that support to move in that direction. With that, I'll pass it off to Jeffrey.